Right.
Kia ora tātou. E mihi anō e tātou mai I te pōnei. Nō reira, kia ora tātou. Kia ora everybody. Welcome everybody to this part of our corridor tonight. We're going to do something a little bit different tonight and go for a bit of a freestyle on some questions around a decision making and some of the compliances of our ancestors, specifically regarding he waka putanga. Nō reira, kia ora tātou. Hei aha te pātai.
Kia ora, Bryce, I've got a question, please. What was the decision-making process our tūpuna used to create he waka putanga?
Thank you, Murray. My understanding is very clear. There's a whakatauki that's used in our mihi and whai kōrero within the whare and at those events, at gatherings, Murray, and the process that was, or the whakatauki that we'd like to disclose this evening is simply Haum, hui, Taik. Now, if I can, in the action or the application of that process being used, it's been well recorded that in 1808, significant northern elders met at a village in the north here in Whangaroa called Tingaire in 1808. Now, what I'd like to disclose or share for a thought is from 1808, they utilised this process for a specific reason they needed an outcome because of contact, Murray, with different countries from around the world. And the conclusion of that process concluded, as we know, on the 28th of October in 1835, some years after the first initial decision was made to create Te Waka Minenga in 1808. Kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora, Bryce. Just a quick question. Why is this process needed?
Yeah, thank you, Murray. Wallace. It's very important to recognise that our tupuna of the past, with the recorded contact, were carried with several labels, right? And one of the main, or a couple of the main labels were they were uneducated, right? And the other label was they carried this particular label in colonising most of the continents around the world when they encountered Indigenous people as being savages, Wallace. So the process was needed by the Indigenous culture here in Aotearoa to, in its way of mitigating those cliches that were used by colonizers when they immediately came here in labeling us, but as we know, and well, as we're finding out and what's being disclosed, especially with the conversations around he waka putanga and the Te Tiriti o Waitangi settlements that have happened throughout the mutu, the inclusion of the Queen, allowing this tribunal process of breaches of Te Tiriti, and all of that information that's been recorded for future generations, they're starting to realise that we had a very, very I'll say divine political system, a divine cultural system, a divine, very intimately divine relationship with our environment, and a very, very astute economic system, Wallace. So how wrong were they in their observation as to all of the Indigenous cultures I'll conclude by saying what I've seen happening now, especially within the science and the political world, is they're seeking advice from the Indigenous cultures around the world, and more so here, in attempts to learn our te reo. We see that, and also learn what we know as tikanga and mātauranga Māori, because of some of the problems that seem to be the only resolve is to go into those cultural practices. Hi, kia ora, Wallace.
Thank you, Bryce. Thank you. That answered a lot. Thank you.
Bryce, I'd like to ask how is that process? How's it used?
Thank you, Murray. If I can, it's being used right now, as I've said, in mihi processes and those formal whai kōrero events. And I don't really want to comment on that, but as we know, at the conclusion of krakia, Haum, hui, Taik, at the conclusion of whakatauki, more tia in some cases, that is being said. Now, there's another, no, what I'm going to say is, how is it used? Right. I've got 3 different ways of how it's used. It wasn't just used for one particular system or process. Now, when I say system, as we know, well, for the North, we have 70 atua. We have Tangaro, Tāwhiri Mātia, Haumia, Tiki, Tāne Mahuta, Tāne Nui Arangi. That's what I'd like to identify as systems. So we're analysing those systems for progress, okay, to get to a decision. So one of those methods or applications through, and I'd also like to disclose here or make a very, very strong comment, Haumie, Hui, Taik are sequences, right? And each sequence has a method of application. So the first method of application, Haumie, in one of the particular processes, is a thought, okay? A thought has come to the mind of an individual, always pre-contact, always for improvement, always for betterment, always for inclusion, okay? Not for selfishness, not for greed, and not for blame. So when someone had a thought, it was for an improvement, Haumie, that thought. That individual person shared that within their whānau, right? And came the next phase, hui, the development, if it was agreed, of that thought, okay? Let's just use a garden for an example. The garden is getting too small. One of the gardeners had a thought, wow, he's looking years ahead, and he has this thought, we need a bigger garden. Right, so intel is gathered on that bigger garden, and when it comes to the development, that thought is spoken about and is talked about. How do we create a bigger garden? There are options within that hui process. Do we make the existing one bigger, or do we find another place to extend that garden or make the garden bigger by a whole new garden area altogether? When all of those statistics are put together, then we conclude with the creation of that development, Taik, and the decision may be, as far as a garden is concerned, with the expansion of a tribe or another tribe extending itself into another area and allowing them to make their garden area in their area with the creation of that decision. And the second one I'd just like to, it's in regards to another form of creation. So Haum is being suggested, as we have spoken about in the first instance, as a thought, okay? So let's go to this consideration. Haum is a point of conception, okay? The joining of two things, two systems, two microorganisms, two things. the conception when two, you can call a tomo, right? An arranged marriage, that's a conception. And the reason for that conception, to unify, and I've heard that story, some tomo were used to unify tribes or, bring them together. And a marriage or the mixing of DNA, right, ensured the future, right? So from that conception, again, you have this development that took place. So what that's identifying, Wallace, is the planning that's involved in the hui part sequence, okay, and the methods of that consideration is used in the planning. So there's a method also in planning, okay, from a cultural point of view, and we may get to that another time. But this process here, Haum, Hui, Taik, is specifically designed to get to a conclusion appropriately for the betterment and for inclusion, as been said. So from a conception, right, and then you have a development of that conception, those two beings coming together. And then you have the creation or the conclusion. And let's talk about a marriage. We have conception of a tomo, right? And well, the conception has been developed within the maternal, and then the baby is born. There's the creation. And that planning of what will happen to that baby, that planning that will happen to the tribe, all of those different concepts are brought in specifically. Nothing is missed out. Nothing is missed out. I want to suggest again strongly that our ancestors were not savages, and they weren't unintelligent. They were very, very intelligent. And that decision-making sequence that they used for planning is a very, from what I've seen, it's very, very exciting and quite relevant to achieving the creation of the development from that conception. Kia ora. I hope that was okay.
I think, Bryce.
So how is it like, I mean, it's relevant because it's a process of thinking, creation, development, but how is it, how can it be applied to what's going on right now? How is it like relevant for, dealing with what is going on currently?
Okay. If we, thank you. That's very, very important. I can make this comment to start with. I can say to identify how it's relevant, how it's applied today. I want to say how it shouldn't be applied so that we get that picture out of the way and set distance between the two. Haum, Hui, Taik is not is not rendered down as a Māori way to move emotion and get emotion past, where it's been suggested, Haum, here's the motion, Hui, we'll put it to the floor, and Taik, we put it to the vote. That's not how our ancestors used it, because you don't have the motion to start with, you have the thought to start with, and the motion comes right at the end, if there is a motion. But in our cultural world, Cora, the motion is in fact a whakahau that's made from that. Now, I'd just like to identify, as far as those sequences are concerned, within the sequence Haum, there are many, many sequences that are used to, or let's say gaps to fill, right, in sequence before it can go into hui for discussion, or for development, or for the information that's been received. So the applied application today to make a decision, information is gathered, Haum, right, and relevant information. That area there, unfortunately, today needs managing, because there's a there's a very, very strong risk of contamination, or let's say propaganda. The information that comes in to make a decision today must be tika, must be pono. So it needs to be screened. Okay, we know what one little piece of propaganda. Now, those sequences within Haum give the ability to eliminate contamination of information that's coming in. And also, there's a point in time where the managing of it requires that all of the sequences have been taken care of. No more information can come in. Okay, so it's been screened for truth and proper, and it's also been screened for that's enough. Okay, so it's got to be stopped. Information must be stopped to come in because it's not relevant. It's not important. So then you take that information or those collection of sequences from Haum into Hui, right, to be discussed. Or let's say it like this as a metaphor for the explanation. We've moved pieces of a jigsaw puzzle from Haum into Hui, right? And the discussion, what the discussion does, it puts all those pieces of that puzzle together to make a picture, right? We don't know what the picture is, but putting all of those sequences together, and again, as a metaphor, right? Making all the lines meet up and all the colors meet up and making all, once the picture is concluded, Taik, you've got your decision. Now, in this case, Hokora, Murray, you conclude with that picture called a whakahau. Okay, we understand what a whakahau is. A whakahau is an order that does not require response. And that's how the He Wakaputanga and the Te Tiriti document was just simply in a brief discussion done as far as application, as far as its development, as far as its creation. And I want to say again, as far as the ancestors saw it, those that put their tohu to it, they understood that intimately, that process that we're talking about, Haum Hui Taik. So if that's okay as an explanation, Kora, kia ora.
So it was used for He Wakaputanga, the development of it. So that was a few years, and to treaty, but was it used for the Treaty of Waitangi?
Now, when it comes to the Te Treaty o Waitangi, there, yes, it was. It was used for that. I'd like to offer this at this particular point in time of the two different dialects of the two different documents, because they bring about not necessarily different sequences, but different methods within those sequences on how that application of the relevant pieces of information. If I can try to explain the differences of those dialects for this process, Haum Hui Taik, the information that was gathered to develop He Wakaputanga came from the dialect of the Rangi Tūhaha, right, or Mana Atua. Now, when it came to the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, you can understand that those sequences, Haum Hui Taik, and the sequences within Haum Hui Taik were a different dialect of the Te Ao Tūroa world, okay, or of the human time, or more specifically and more importantly, the mana whenua, mana moana kōrero, or kōrero from Hapu, because of their relationship. It was, although Te Waka Meninga is mentioned in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it was exposure of Hapu that was exposed, or the Te Ao Tūroa that was exposed in the Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I hope that's okay, Hokora, in that explanation for how this process was used and how relevant is it today. It's more relevant today than ever because of the propaganda, because of the conspiracy things. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with conspiracy or those kinds of thoughts, But what it does do when it comes to those pieces of information that you're unsure about, it strictly uses there are, I think, 3 or 4 sequences, if not 8 of them, within Haum, Hui, Taik that are purposely there to weed out parts that aren't ready or aren't important for this particular. It doesn't mean they get thrown away. It just means they're fitting within the wrong paradigm. We're talking about tangaro. We're not talking about tāne. So, they're put aside and fitted into each one of those areas of responsibility. Ka pai? Good. All right. I think that's us. I just want to thank everybody again for this little conversation that we've had, or chat, or sequence of questions for this evening. Happy to be here. Nō reira huri nō. Kia ora tātou.